Hello, and thank you for joining us tonight, whether on Facebook, Vimeo, YouTube, or our website. I am Nathan Winkelstein, Associate Producer at Red Bull Theater, and host of tonight's remarkable Podversation. For those of you joining us for the first time, these are informal conversations designed to provide insight into how great classical performers approach character and text. They are designed to be lots of fun for both those of us participating and those of you watching at home. And if you wish to participate, part of the informal discussion is you. If you are watching this on Facebook, you can type in questions into the chat at any time, and we will answer as many as we can as we go along. So please do engage with us. This evening's Podversation will focus on the titular character of Shakespeare's first tetralogy, or at least of the first three, and that is, of course, Henry VI, with specific emphasis on his famous Homely Swain speech from Part 3. Our guest tonight is an Obie and Olivier Award-winning classical actor who has wowed audiences on both sides of the pond with his performances of Hamlet, Othello, Torvald, and Henry VI, along with many more. He has taught and performed many times for Red Bull Theater and is one of the most incisive actors I have had the pleasure to converse with. He is CHUKWUDI IWUJI. Hi, Chuck.
Wow. I'll slip you the money later on, Nathan, for that one.
Yeah, well, I have to butter you up so that you're willing to answer all my tough questions.
Exactly. Look, I have a drink to help me with that.
Perfect.
Do you have a drink yourself? What do you
Boom.
have? All right, great.
Yes, cheers. And join us at home, whether with drinks of this kind or tea or water or anything you wish.
I've grown very close to tequila.
Yes.
Anyway.
I've grown very close to Manhattan in all sorts of ways, including my cocktail.
Best drink. Whenever in doubt, go with the Manhattan.
Exactly. So everybody, Chuck has agreed to give us a little bit of a read of the Homely Swain speech, but to provide you some context for what he's going to be reading. Henry VI, the son of the late, great Henry V, has endured a troublesome reign marked by territorial losses in France and civil war at home. A man who wished to avoid conflict, Henry VI agreed to give up his son's right to the throne in favor of the Yorks in order to preserve peace, but instead lost the respect of his wife and his allies, who pursued his son's right to the throne in spite of the king. Henry, now shunted aside, sits and watches the Battle of Towton, where his wife and son battle the Yorks, and Englishman fights Englishman, while the king is relegated to a simple bystander.
This battle fares like to the morning's war, when dying clouds contend with growing light. What time the shepherd, blowing of his nails, can neither call it perfect day nor night. Now sways it this way like a mighty sea, forced by the tide to combat with the wind. Now sways it that way like the selfsame sea, forced to retire by fury of the wind. Sometime the flood prevails, and then the wind, now one the better, then another best, both tugging to be victors breast to breast, yet neither conqueror nor conquered. So is the equal poise of this fell war. Here on this molehill will I sit me down, to whom God will, there be the victory. For Margaret, my queen, and Clifford too, have chid me from the battle, swearing both they prosper best of all when I am thence. Would I were dead, if God's good will were so. For what is this world but grief and woe? Oh God, methinks it were a happy life to be no better than a homely swain, to sit upon a hill as I do now, to carve out dials quaintly, point by point, thereby to see the minutes, how they run, how many make the hour full complete, how many hours bring about the day, how many days will finish up the year, how many years a mortal man may live. When this is known, then to divide the times, so many hours must I tend my flock, so many hours must I take my rest, so many hours must I contemplate, so many hours must I sport myself. So many days my ewes have been with young, so many weeks ere the poor fools will eat, so many years ere I shall shear the fleece. So minutes, hours, days, months, and years passed over to the end they were created would bring white hairs onto a quiet grave. Oh, what a life were this! How sweet, how lovely. Gives not the hawthorn bush a sweeter shade to shepherds looking on their silly sheep than doth a rich embroidered canopy to kings that fear their subjects' treachery? Oh, yes, it doth. 1,000-fold it doth. And to conclude, the shepherd's homely curds, his cold, thin drink out of his leather bottle, his wonted sleep under a fresh tree's shade, all which secure and sweetly he enjoys, is far beyond a prince's delicates. His viand sparkling in a golden cup, his body couched in a curious bed, when care, mistrust, and treason wait on him. It's taking me back.
Yeah. Yes, and I didn't mention specifically when Chuk played this role, but Chuk played this role for the RSC. You did it in all 3 shows, correct?
Yes, I was, yeah, I did it right through, you know, so starting as a 14-year-old boy, roughly, to a man of about 60 when he dies, yeah.
And in that production, it was directed by Michael Boyd, and it was part of a sort of a season of these histories, correct?
Yeah, it was quite extraordinary because what had happened is the 6 years previously, Michael had done just the first trilogy, chronologically speaking. The Henry VI is 1, 2, and 3, and Richard III. David Oyelowo had done Henry VI then. So 6 years later, he decided that he didn't want to just do that tetralogy. He wanted to do both tetralogies. So starting historically from Richard II all the way to Richard III. So that's 8 plays. And he decided he would do it uniquely with the same company. I think there were about 36 actors or something like that, playing, I don't know, between 300 and 400 roles, something ridiculous like that over the course of it. And what he did, he carefully really mapped out tracks for people. My track was pretty easy, at least for that tetralogy, because I was Henry VI right through, and then Henry VI in Richard III, who then becomes the gardener, all the harbingers of doom for Richard later on, because he, of course, murders me. And it was just, it's so weird. I remember it was 2.5 years of our lives, basically. And it made our careers in many ways, at least in the classical world. And it was Sir Michael Boyd, who's just one of the great directors alive, who, despite urging from a lot of people, refused to go with known big names, really wanted to create a company of, like they did in the old days of the RSC, find the actors and make stars of them if you want to, or let them have a go at this. And this was us. Jesus, I look so young in that picture. And this was us just going for it and becoming a brotherhood and a sisterhood and a company of actors going through a lot. We learned a lot. In that time, parents died. One of the cast members is Miles Richardson. His father, Ian Richardson, passed away. People got sick. So much happened history-wise for us, as well as growing into those roles. It's quite there are 3 major turning points in my life in theatre, and that was certainly the first and possibly most profound of them.
It was interesting, I had all of these, the way a host does, pre-prepped sort of questions about that speech.
Yeah.
And I'm gonna toss them because I was, this speech, I have to admit, this speech and this role has always bemused me in terms of how does one make this role compelling, to be honest. And and it was one of the reasons why I wanted you on is because I have seen you do a number of shows and I've never seen you not be compelling. So I was curious how you did it. But what was most striking to me as you were just doing it is, of course, the I hesitate to use this word, but the striking melancholia of it, but the yearning for what the audience, or what I at least right now would describe as normalcy, which is not, of course, his normalcy, but the yearning for it. And how particularly striking that was, as you just did it right now, for a yearning to have a schedule and understand how your life works at a time where everybody's lives are turned upside down. And it's just interesting how just in you doing it, not even in you needing to talk about it, you've already made it so much more kind of compelling and speak to us. So thank you for that.
Thank you for saying that. Yeah.
And is he unique in that way as a king seeking out?
Well, when you see the kings, he's sandwiched between when you think Richard III and then you think of Henry V, his father. Yeah, okay, fine. If using those parameters of action, he's not the king. I mean, look, it's very interesting. Once you commit to playing a role, it's your responsibility not to judge the role and to find what you can attach yourself to within the role. I'll tell you a funny story, just to go back. I did an audition for this role. I had been called in by Michael to audition for Hotspur because we were going to do the whole trilogy. That was going to be my main role, Hotspur. And I went into the audition, and it was, I did my Hotspur thing, the Pinsett speech, the famous speech of complaining about this idiot that you sent to me. I thought I was rather good at Hotspur. And then at the end of the audition, Michael Boyd sort of just looked at me, and he nodded. And this was his action. And he reached over, and he took a copy of Henry, I could see it was Henry VI, and he leafed through it to the Molehill speech and just said, "Do this for me, cold read." Okay, now this is attached to another story. This is going to answer your question about how I approached Henry. This is attached to another story. This was in 2006. In 2000, I was finishing off a season at the American Players Theater because I went to drama school in Milwaukee. And my late brother, my eldest brother, called me before he passed away, and he was chatting about Manchester United had just pulled off a ridiculous win to win the Champions League, in '99, and we were talking about that. This was in '99 before he actually passed in 2000. And as we were talking about all sorts of things, he mentioned the fact that there was a black guy playing the king on the RSC stage for the first time ever, David Oyelowo. And I remember my brother saying, just thinking about it, maybe you should think about coming back. Maybe this is a good time to finally come back. This was 2000, actually. This was the summer of 2000. And I remember thinking, yeah, of course, if we've got to a point where, because the RSC was my dream place to work at, if we've got to a place where black guys playing the king, this is a good time for me to come back. I'm going to do that. And I promised him that. It was the last full conversation I had with him, because between then and when I next saw him, he'd gone into surgery and he soon passed away. And so fast forward 6 years, literally 6 years. And I'm in the office with Michael Boyd, and he gives me this speech of Henry VI. And this is normally when actors would panic or go, "Geez, can I have a minute?" And he said, "Do you need him?" And I said, "No, I think I'm ready to do this." And I did it, and I didn't think about all the things I don't think when I was preparing Hotspur, all that stuff. I just did it because it just felt that's what I should be doing. And then when I got the role with Henry, all those judgments people had, it always surprised me as people would mention judgments, talk about he's not very incompetent. I didn't see it that way. I saw it as this guy, okay, now I get to play him as a kid. And I get it. He wants everyone to come together. Oh God, then he finds his love. He's not very good at love. And then he finds Margaret and he's in love. And then that goes wrong. And then she doesn't love him and he doesn't get it. And then he's trying to keep the country together. And the Yorks and the Lancasters, they fight. I don't want this war. And by the end of it, he's an old man that's tired. I saw that journey. I never thought, it never occurred to me of like, oh, he's not a good king or he's a weak king. All my choices were based on someone coming from a deeply good place, a place ordained by God in his head. So those judgments people put of weak and whatever, I leave that to the audience. It's not what I played. It didn't interest me. It wouldn't have helped me. I played the moment to moment and the beats in this chap guy's life and the bad decision but even the bad decisions he made, which with hindsight's a bad decision, they were the best decisions I could make as Henry at the time, in my opinion. And that's all that mattered to me as an actor. That's what mattered to me as an actor. So it's interesting to have a titular character in 3 plays. Who else has that in the whole canon? And yet, you can't say any of the plays belong to him, which is the key to Henry, is that he is the conscience that all these guys were acting on the 100 Years of War, the War of the Roses. He is the conscience. He is also the victim. And he is the observer of all those things. So I didn't need to be a protagonist. I was sort of like the basin into which all that emotion and heartache and pain and death fell into. And that filled me up. So the minutes I would try to be the protagonist when I was getting a bit bored of seeing Warwick steal the show and stuff, it would never work. It would never work. He's not that guy. So yeah, so that's sort of the holistic version of coming to that role. You've got to give yourself over to that role. And you have to be very careful. Just because another character describes you as something doesn't mean you play that. Doesn't even mean it's true.
Right.
It has to be true to you moment to moment.
Yeah, I mean, it's well. See, now I want to do it. But yeah, it is. Even just listening to you do the speech there, and this was one of my questions was, you look at Henry V, and you take away the kind of rose-colored glasses of him in that play, and the sort of manipulation that he does, and the fact that everybody goes, oh yes, he believes that he has a right to France, which is not actually really true. His father told him in order to unify the lords, you need to go fight French people, so he did it.
You need a war.
Right.
That sounds familiar, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Well, but it's actually where I'm going, I think, is that, like, in some ways, I guess what is maybe compelling, as you describe him, is that he is a good man. And a good man does not necessarily make, from an outside eye, a good king. No. And that is, and it's been interesting, the last sort of series of these we've done. We've dealt with Prospero and Volumnia, and in both of those cases sort of ended up with people who are miscast. Volumnia is a mother who has to be a father. Prospero is a father who has to be a mother. And this is a good man who has to be a king. And so it's like something that Shakespeare seems to go, or like Hamlet, which I know you've also played, the thinking man's prince who has to be a revenger, and that Shakespeare has this brilliant way of not allowing us to play a guy dead straight, but making them humans.
Well, Shakespeare understood the basic concept of drama, which is conflict. And it's as simple as that. Drama is conflict. And if everything fits, there is no conflict. You can name every one of those. You spoke of Volumnia, you talk of Coriolanus, a man being asked to be in government that's actually a warrior, a man being asked to be a son that wants to be a soldier. I mean, it's all there. And I think that's what he does. That's how he sets up the conflict, because he starts with the conflict within the character before the conflict of the plot. And that's what makes it absolutely brilliant. You couldn't have put Henry. It would have been an interesting play to put a character like Henry V in Henry VI.
Right.
You could
almost argue
nature doesn't work.
Right. You could almost argue he did, and her name was Margaret.
Margaret of Anjou. That's it. That's the whole thing. And I feel that. But specifically with Shakespeare, he's always been fascinated with rulers, with kings, with the people we are supposed to trust. and that God-given right, I mean, especially in this trilogy, starting with Richard II, whose main fault was the complete belief in his sanctity as a king, right through to Richard III, who says, what is it? He says, with I no friends to back my suits at all, but the plain devil and dissembling looks and yet to win, and fuck it, fuck the gods, fuck all of that. I am the god of myself. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. If heaven
Can I
made
swear
cooked
on
my
this
body.
show? I just, yeah. So I feel that that's his thing. He's always putting people in the wrong place at the wrong time for them, and they have to find their way out of it. I mean, even in the love stories, in the Romeo and Juliet, what's the conflict he tells? Sorry, you're with the Montagues and you're with the Capulet. There's your conflict. And in many ways, Juliet should have been the guy in that show, and in the traditional sense, because she leads Romeo through it. You know what I mean?
Right.
And he did that. He gave this role to a woman, saying, "Actually, look at it this way." Instead of the preconceived notions of who should be leading the relationship at the time. So I feel the conflict is a big part of the personal conflict, is a big part of how he writes.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting. I feel like I teach that and yet hadn't put it together with this character in particular about the man who would be a homely swain, right?
As he says, this is really. And don't forget, he came to the crown at 9 months old. He was 9 months. So his whole life has been people telling him what to do, and then suddenly he has to be a king, and yet and there's a thing that he never had a choice. That's another thing about power and inheritance, is sometimes you don't have a choice.
Did you? So obviously there's the moment in the play, or perhaps not obviously, this isn't like one of the more performed trilogies in the world, but the moment that where Henry, in an attempt to prevent more violence, does give up his son's inheritance to the throne. Given how you were thinking about this character, what did Henry almost see that as like freeing his son from that responsibility in your mind, or did you see that as a moment of weakness in the character? What was that?
I never saw it as a moment of weakness. That's for other people to. I saw it as a moment of great sacrifice. Was more interesting to me. He says later on in this scene, don't forget that straight after this, he sees a father realize he slayed his son.
Yes.
Father and son fight. And then the father realizes he's killed his son in this civil war. And then one of my favorite lines, he goes, "Oh, pictures, spectacle, or bloody times, whiles, lions, war, and battle for their dens. Poor harmless lambs abide their enmity." The victims of the hardest hit people in war, civil war being the worst kind, are the harmless souls, are the kids. And I remember when we were performing this, I think there'd been a strike on Lebanon or something. And there was, in the front page of the newspapers in England, was a father holding his daughter, dead daughter, literally roaring at the camera with grief. You started the show off by saying how relevant Shakespeare always seems to be. Because we keep repeating ourselves. So when Henry does that, he's doing the best thing he can to just stop the killing and stop the death. And yes, to spare his son from the fact that he'll be stabbed. Because what does his son have to look forward to? Care, mistrust, and treason. There's nothing in Henry's life that has convinced him that power is a good thing. But that aside, I think the more immediate cause of why he does it is that, and anyone can interpret it as they want. Yes, there's a lot of people that say that was the worst decision he could have made. But the decision I made for Henry is that this killing has to stop.
Right.
Yeah,
well, and he is the only character who isn't driven by, well, maybe I don't want to be completely didactic, but feels like the only character in this trilogy, and actually in many of the early tragedies and histories, who isn't driven to constantly revenge. That vicious cycle of, you killed my person, so I kill you, which means you kill you, which goes on in Richard III with the conversation about, you killed this kid, so I killed this kid. So and Henry's ability to look beyond that and look to peace and look to not killing.
not kill. I remember being asked that question in an interview at the time of him seen as a weak king and defending it, saying how you know, when you're in power, it's easy to order men to war. It's not actually difficult to do that. The strength comes in being ready to take the hit when you try to be the bigger person. That's why I always saw Henry as quite strong, actually, you know.
Yeah, well, and I mean, I guess he might kill me for mentioning it, but you mentioned your brother. I'll mention
Hmm.
mine.
Hmm.
He served in both Iraq and Afghanistan, and he said that the hardest thing that ever happened to him was not leading men into battle; it was seeing the results of orders he gave. Even for victorious things, is seeing the damage done, and that humanity, it's a very basic human thing that soldiers are sometimes trained to not think about, or potentially
Hmm.
policemen are trained to not think about, or all of that stuff, but that it's still a central part of humanity, which Henry, or at least your Henry, it seems, very much embodied.
That's what I said about him being the basin into which all the grief is poured into, and let our hearts and eyes like civil war be blind with tears and break or charge with grief. There is something about civil war, you know, especially. But you know, in the war, I mean, I was a friend of mine is in the special forces. He said the first thing you would do after a mission in which you've killed people is to put the men to work straight away. You come back, okay, clean your weapons, clean your boots, clean the barracks. Do not give them time to stop and think about what just happened.
Right.
Keep it going.
Right.
Keep it going.
Yeah.
Um,
And Henry
and I
wants to
think
think.
and Henry is the one who isn't in the maelstrom, who actually, in fact, the way we staged it was absolutely stunning. Is while he's doing this molehill speech, is he walks through the heart of the battle just before the speech, through it. It was choreographed, so people are literally being slaughtered and somehow walking through it. And then as they retreated, I found myself on the molehill, and he is the only one who's left to sort of think of the consequence of everything. You know, he is the conscience of the piece.
And the brilliant, I mean, I realize that this isn't an actable part of it. It's more kind of a just a nod to how unbelievably brilliant this playwright we both love is. Even here in the very nascence of his career, it's just the incredible symbolism of the use of the molehill previously to
Hmm.
embarrass and belittle York, the man who would be
Yeah,
king, is the
with the
same.
paper crown. Yeah,
Right. And then Henry, the man who would be a homely swain, goes
right.
and seeks out that same language, those same
Yes.
words, which, I realize that's not an actionable thing. It's more just a nod to how
It is
unbelievably
a nod
dramatic.
to like, and I think it's a nod to how one of the things you mentioned, the director Michael Boyd, Sir Michael Boyd, is he completely understands the is spirituality, the right word? But there is some things actually we've dealt with the intellect and the direction and the acting and the whatever. There's the being, you know what I mean? And the spirit of the tragedy we had to live with. He had, I don't know how he nurtured it in us, but we were aware of it as we spoke the words. Heartbreaking scene with York when York is given the napkin spotted with Rutland's blood. Heartbreaking. And I mean, I would watch that before I did the scene to use that to understand what we're dealing with, you know?
In your you described, sort of, as you gave a very quick character arc of Henry, you described, certainly sounds correct to me, that he
Mm.
does truly love Margaret.
Hmm.
What was How was it to play the tension of loving this woman who, first of all, didn't love you, and second of all, did these things?
Well, I don't witness a lot of the things she does, and by the time the things are made clear to me, I banish Suffolk and tell her. I remember when eventually I do banish Suffolk and then tell her that to just stop. I remember the audience really loving that. It's a bit like watching Game of Thrones and watching Cersei finally get her own. But as far as playing it, Katie Stevens, who played Margaret, is just one of the most exceptional actors I've ever. I've been very lucky. I was just thinking about the other day, thinking about this play. I think of Katie and the other actors we had in that, and also when I did Romeo and Juliet and the Juliet, and I just go, when he takes the time to write women, he does it, really incredibly. And Katie was a perfect match. Katie is from Coventry, real, she's so without any pretensions, earthy, whatever. And having to lock that all up for the Margaret we meet at least at the beginning, but still having this fire coming through her. It was easy to see how Henry was easily infatuated with her. He'd never seen anyone like this. And Katie doubled as Joan of Arc in part 1. So the same actress, literally, we ended part 1 with Joan of Arc having this magical change after her death into the fire and emerging as Katie in a red velvet thing, and Suffolk announcing her to me. So you understood this king didn't have a chance in this woman's hands, the power.
Right.
So and again, I'll come to the same thing. I wasn't there thinking, oh, it's going to be, I was thinking, I meet her, I've never seen a woman before, I'm going to lose my virginity to this woman. Yes. I was thinking all the things you're thinking. I'm a kid at the time. He's roughly about 15 when he meets her, whatever. It's the bubbling up, the excitement. And until I know, I don't preempt the moment. And then when I know, you crack. My heart cracked. But it's not going to crack if you're preempting it and waiting for it to happen. So I invested completely in falling in love with this uber woman and let the audience knew before I did. And then when I found out, it cracked.
Yeah, it's Chuck, the sort of run through of everything you're saying, and I don't mean to hammer on it, but I think that we probably both agree it is what makes Shakespeare exceptional, and frankly what makes exceptional acting. Is it's just interesting to hear you say in so many ways how important it is to play these people, these kings that we've known in this famous playwright's play for 400 years as humans, as people, and that really is, I mean, Shakespeare, as I'm assuming most of the audience on this would know, Shakespeare didn't really write many of his plots. He that's not what makes Shakespeare Shakespeare. It's his language and his characters. And just hearing you sort of talk about the incredibly human aspect of Henry VI and how I feel like oftentimes people can lose that in Shakespeare plays. They start worrying about playing what a person is instead of who a person is.
Exactly. And you're weighed down by history, aren't you? Not so much Henry VI, because now I knew, but I certainly felt it playing Hamlet. I was aware of it playing Hamlet, and I'm certainly aware of it playing Othello, and I almost turned down Romeo because of what everyone has said about Romeo. Like, he's this wet blanket, that's soppy and whatever. And you're like, well, I want to play Mercutio then. I'd rather do that. He seems more interesting. Then you read it. Then you read about a guy who's ready to climb a wall into the land, into the compound of a family that would kill him if they found him. The same guy is ready to say, let me stand here until you remember what you're going to say. I'll just stand here. The same guy that later then calls, as a kid, goes, oh, I love my wife, calling a young girl, a guy that has the maturity to do that. Then you go, no, then I'm not going to, it's not about what people said. I see who this guy is for myself. And it is always about, with Henry, it's the same thing, and it certainly was with Hamlet. It's like you shut. It's interesting, it's fun, it bigs you up because you're like, oh, it's my turn to play this, but that has to stay out the door, and you start with the humanities and the same questions you would ask if someone was had written a new piece. It's the same questions, the motivations, the humanity of it. And it's harder with Shakespeare because people have been drummed into this thing that is Shakespeare. Right down to people suddenly, have you noticed how people will, if you tell them to do a piece from Mammoth, they'll do it. And then as soon as you say, okay, can you show me a classical piece? They go into this weird voice.
Yes, I have.
This mask, this idea of doing it properly. The late Kristen Linklater, who I can't believe is dead. She was a guest on the show I do, Bounded in a Nutshell, which you know about. just a few weeks ago and a few weeks before she passed away, but was just talking about, it's about opening up your imagination, you. It isn't about a concept of a person who played it and this is how I should sound. I remember when I arrived at the RSC, I wanted to impress them because I trained in America and I'm at the Royal. It was my first job moving back to London was at the RSC. So I went and I got myself a recording of Alex Jennings, who has the most beautiful voice, reading sonnets to train myself with Alex Jennings. And I remember on my first day, the great Cicely Berry demanded I come to do a voice class with her. And I walked in and I felt, oh yeah. And also I've been doing these, this is how old I am. I've been doing these cassettes of Alex Jennings. Cicely nodded, she goes, uh-huh. She took the cassettes and she flung them across the room. I said, never, ever use anyone else's voice but your own. Just flung them. And that was a big lesson for me,
I know it's so you've talked a lot about the humanity and bringing yourself to the role and also about not turning into what I call a Shakespeare robot, right? Not worrying about doing it right. There really is no right. There's just true. But I worry because I know how sometimes audiences about Shakespeare think that could be seen as a takedown of verse. But I actually know that you're extremely studious about using verse and all of that stuff. Can you talk a little bit about how you marry the technique and the tools of using Shakespeare's verse to the everything you've described so far about finding your personal humanity?
Absolutely. I mean, verse is there to help you. A lot of people see it as this restrictive thing that puts you into a corset. Verse is, people talk about Shakespeare being the greatest writer of all time and minimize his directing down to exit pursued by a bear or exit, that's it. No, it's the opposite. He's directing you pretty much on every line. And the way he directs you without being a director, but directs you through your language is with the verse. So like everything else, I remember my second job after the RSC was at the National and being directed in the back eye by Peter Hall. And I remember preparing for the audition and everyone told me, just make sure you speak the verse properly. Because Peter didn't really watch you when you audition. He's not interested in how interesting you are. He sits there and he almost closes his eyes and he listens to the verse, the music. And I remember after the audition, he didn't say well acted or anything. He just said, well spoken, and I got the part. I think like anything else, learn the rules. Rules are a bad word. Learn the tips, suggestions, tools, so that you can throw them away. It's like watching, look, I can play anything from, okay, we know we're improvising jazz and blues, so everyone expects that. But actually, you can do a lot of that in classical music. I can play a section out of Chopin and keep the same time signature, but even though I'll end up with the same time signature, the way I get to the next note can vary and can be very different from just listen to the greats playing the same piece of Shakespeare and whatever, they're not, and it varies. So I really think that with the verse, if you understand that it's there to help you. For instance, this speech we just did, which is early Shakespeare, that is very rhythmical. It's literally most of the time, ti-tum, 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 ti-tum. Literally, if you trust that, you know exactly the words to stress. And he literally finishes thoughts very clearly. Later Shakespeare, certainly by when he gets to the Tempest, which is, whoa, breaking up lines and all that. But this early stuff, his thoughts are so clear by the lines, whatever, that you can literally speak to the end of the line, then start the next line, and then start the next line. That's what I used in the read-through with Michael Boyd, not having prepared. So what he does is that I think the verse is really there to very much help you, because all the things we would do with a lot of modern writing, like pulling our hair out and trying to find the emotional thing. I always use the example of Hermione. when she's brought out to court, the late Tim Pigott-Smith, everyone's dying, taught this to me. And Hermione, when she comes, you often see actors when they're doing that speech running the lines because the thoughts run from one line to the other. Since what I might do, and see that it bequeaths me to say not get, they run it for logic. But if you run it to the verse line, which is one of the rules, and take a little pause and start, you realize that, oh my God, she's breaking up her lines in the weirdest moments. Why is she doing that? Oh, of course. She's just given birth. She's tired. She's confused. She doesn't know what's going on. So, of course, her thoughts aren't going to. And then as she finds her footing towards the end of the speech, right after she says, oh, by the way, let me just say something to you guys. When she finds her footing, suddenly the thoughts match the line. And she can go to line and you feel the strength coming. Do you see what I'm saying? So I feel that verse, I think it takes away the effort of a lot of modern acting as we were, because verse is actually more human than anything. It's tied to the rhythm of our heartbeat. If you just don't know what to do and you're not sure how to play this, Jesus, this speech killed me every night because I knew it was a high point of his emotion, but some nights I wasn't there. But when someone hears you go, so many hours must I tend my flock, so many hours must I do, just by doing that, they're crying for you before I'm even thinking of crying. So I would say that verse is, there's some people that break it. There's some people that don't like the tips. Good on them. That's not to say they can't still be compelling. I know when I know that I can trust the verse to take care of so much of that work, I can live in the imagination, what each word means to me. I can let my emotional life take care of itself because it's been driven along by the verse. And I don't have to struggle so hard to get there. And also clarity. We do so much of the work for our audiences as actors. We want to cry for them. We want to do everything. The audience doesn't want to, they're not interested in seeing you cry. They want to cry for you. They want you to say something that takes something for them and then they cry for you. They don't want to see you cry. They think they want to see you cry because that's considered great acting, but actually they don't. And then if you cry, because by saying that thing, it's affected you and it comes from a real place and you surprise yourself as an actor that you're crying, think of what you're doing to those people if you can surprise yourself. So I learn all the rules, I use them, and I every time I come to difficult, especially as is later plays, when it becomes seemingly a bit more difficult to go to the end of the line and stuff, I try to do it. And I ask myself, what is it doing to me viscerally and physically and mentally to make that line work? And how can I exhaust trying to make that work before I throw it away? And I know the rules well enough that if I choose to throw them away, I'll throw them away, But you've got to know the rules before you throw them away. And there's a good example here where he talks about thus hours. Yes, if you've been doing the verse and getting on with it and speaking it, when you've got to a place where he just goes thus hours, where is this? Okay, so he goes, so minutes, hours. Yeah, you've earned it. If I choose to say actually no, I'm going to slow down because up until then I've been so many hours must I contemplate, so many hours must I sport myself, so many days my youths have been with young, so many weeks ere the poor fools will eat, so many years ere I shall share the feast. So minutes, hours, you have all the time in the world because you've earned it. We are not going to sit around watching you try and tug all that stuff. The whole speech will be there till next Tuesday. But you've earned it if you've got to that point, And there's another thing I noticed, actually, going over it again today. Where he goes, so minutes, hours, days, this very line. So minutes, hours, days, months, and years. I remember going, so minutes, hours, days, weeks, months, and years. I hope that's because we decided we wanted to make the line complete, because he doesn't say weeks. But if you're using the verse rule and you don't want to add weeks to make the line complete and you think you've only been given 9 beats, that's the extra beat that you can spread out through the rest of the line to give you time. Do you see what I'm saying? So you've shared, and that's what I meant by the playing the classical music, is that it's still the same line, but because it's only given you 9 beats instead of 10, you know what? Take that 10th beat and spread it out between each of those and take your time throughout the whole line. So that's sort of what I think. Did that make sense?
I actually want to just I want to give you back the money you gave me for the intro. I actually feel like if we just clipped that section and gave it to everybody who wants to act Shakespeare, we would immediately up the level of Shakespeare acting in this country.
Thank you, mate.
But I just think everything you say it much more compellingly and eloquently than I ever could. But it really is. I mean, what struck me very early on what you said is that it's Shakespeare directing you, and how just that in and of itself, how unbelievably awesome that is. That you have 400 years later, when you're sitting and looking at those words, that if you know how to do it, that you have a direct line to him saying, this is how I think you should do it. As an actor and a writer and a genius, this is how I think you should do these lines. And I just think that's... It's something I always talk about with Shakespeare, about how the verse supports. The way you put it is great in that way. To think that you get to be directed by William Shakespeare and doing his plays 400 years later is a truly extraordinary thing.
Feat, yeah.
Yeah. I did notice one question that popped up that I want to get to, mainly to let my brain settle from the amazing level of stuff you just threw out. Which it was something I let go and almost followed up earlier, but Mark Rifkin caught it. Thank you, Mark. You mentioned that there were three turning points in your career, and that the Henry VI was the first. Have to know what the other two are.
The second one was playing Buckingham in Sam Mendes' production of Richard III with, a name that isn't so popular now, with Kevin Spacey playing Richard III. That was another turning point, because it was my introduction really to the wider American audience, because we did a world tour, then came to New York. But I remember, as any actor, right, one of the hardest things to believe in as an actor, and it ebbs and flows. Sometimes we believe it, sometimes we believe it a bit less. And the whole journey is trying to believe it as much as possible, is that you can be interesting. you can trust in who you are, meeting the character, and that's enough. Because who you are also consists of how much you've worked, how hard you've worked, how, rigorous you are with that. But also that when you turn up, you can turn up and be present, And I remember in Buckingham, I remember the audition with Sam. Meeting Sam, it was a weird audition, because I met with him and I was like, oh, Jesus Christ, it's Sam Mendes. Oh, what, Kevin Spacey is going. And I just literally the day before said to my agent, no more Shakespeare. I've said that several times throughout my life, and it just doesn't happen. It's like Michael Corleone in The Godfather. Every time I try and get out, they drag me back in. And I said, no more Shakespeare. Literally a week before, and then she called us. She said, so what do you think about Buckingham? And I was like, I don't know. Buckingham is great, And I was like, oh, who's directing? And she went, Sam Mendes. I was like, okay. Who's Richard? Kevin Spacey. I was like, oh, shit. Where? Old Vic. Oh, shit. Everything, But I remember playing that role, this thing about being present. I remember turning up for Sam and being so comfortable with my idea of Buckingham that I could just talk to Sam Mendes. Up until the point that when Sam actually said, do you want to read a bit of Buckingham? I actually said, no, Sam, you know what's weird? I've always wanted to play Coriolanus. Rather than read this, why don't I give you some of my Coriolanus? And that was me completely comfortable. And I walked out of the room going, what the hell was I thinking? And then I got the role. And I was like, you can bring yourself. So that was big. And also it was a big job. It brought me over to America. I got my manager from that. It changed the thing. And the third thing was actually here and another lesson learned from it was when I did Enobarbus, Terrell Alvin McCraney's Cleopatra. And I played Enobarbus at the Public. It was my first gig at the Public. And as you know, the Public has become my fairy godmother and the home to my career in America in many ways. But I remember going into the audition the first time I met Heidi and Terrell and being convinced I'd blown it. I'd blown it. I just wasn't on. And then they gave me the role. And that's when the other lesson you have to learn, which is like, what is yours, right? Whatever you do, you can go in and have the best audition in your life and not get it. And you can go in and have the worst audition in your life, I felt, and get it. And then that changed your life. And I remember doing that show. Why it was a turning point was not only learning that lesson, but I remember the opening night when we came to New York, Oscar used to take me aside and just going, I want to do big things with you. And that was the next shift for my time in America. But they were all linked not just to the production, but to what it's doing to you as a person, as a performer, as your confidence, as your belief in yourself and letting go. And like I say, it's an ebb and flow. Some days I wake up completely buoyed by that, and other days I've forgotten it and I'm back to the cringing, driveling, terrified soul that we often are, you know.
I think that's it's interesting because as you know, I acted for a long time before moving into direction and so on and so forth, and it's interesting to be I'm slightly ashamed that I think I forgot this for a second. It's interesting to be reminded how important an actor's personal self-worth is, and how that has to be nurtured by the entire industry, because it allows the actor to be themselves and to perform. And that of course it is at the end of the day up to a performer to have their own self-worth, as you have, but that it's also interesting from the other side of making sure that you're building a supportive environment in all sorts of ways to build up self-worth, because it is very hard to walk into an audition, give what you think is yourself, and get a no. That's a really tough thing to do, and building up self-worth is hard.
There's nothing natural about auditioning. There's nothing natural. It's the most unnatural, flawed part of this industry in making it work. Really isn't. We do the best we can. All you have, as Richard Jenkins, who was another one of the guests in it, he said, and I wrote it down, he said, you're not obligating. Give up the sense of obligation. Obligation that this is how this part should be played. Obligation of this is what the producer wants to see. Obligation of this is what the director wants to see. Give up. Just throw that out of the way. Obligation of this is the part where he should cry or she should cry. If you're not feeling it, it's not an obligation. Do you know what I mean? And one of the big changes that happened to me, and I said it to my now wife, then partner, she at the time, and I said, I remember saying, Angela, it's like, there was around 2016, around Hamlet, it was before Hamlet, actually. I'd had a series of disappointments. I remember I had gone up for the Crucible with Eva Van Hove, didn't get it, although I got, the callback and all that stuff, and the film had fallen through, didn't get a TV thing had fallen through, didn't get, like, it was piling up, and I realized that my emotional life was going like this, up and down, and I remember I can't do it like this anymore. I can't be happy and then sad and happy. It's too much. And that's when I went back to all the books I'd read about equanimity and meditation, and finding now they made sense why I need that, why you need your support group, why you need stuff outside of it, because the industry is built to do that, up and down. An acceptance is great, a rejection is flat, a hit is great, a bum is flat, a good review is great. You've got to find a way of cutting through all of those. And the biggest change I made to my life isn't taking an acting class or working harder. The biggest change I think that made to my life, which is a work in progress because you have to keep working it, was to ask myself genuinely, why am I doing this? And why I'm doing it is a way, it sounds like a cliche, but it's a pursuit of happiness. And a pursuit of happiness mainly includes your family life, your friends, how you wake up in the morning, whatever. Acting is just what I do, and I'm lucky it's what I do. I'm lucky it's a great outlet. I'm lucky it's a creative thing. But every success of acting is only a success depending on how it affects that pursuit of happiness, which is yourself. It's not actually the job. As I ticked off more and more ambitions in my life as an actor, as I got to do that, as I got to be on set in Italy, as I got to do all those things I wanted. And you turn up on set and it's just like the last job. It's the next day of the job. The high was learning you found it, got the job. That's the best part of getting a gig for me is the call saying you got, and then it fizzles out and then you get on with the job. But what's great about it is I can plan holiday in July because I know I've been given this cushion, you know what I mean, to spend with my wife or to spend with my dad or to spend. We've got to remember it's what we do. I wasn't born into this world as an actor. It's what I became, you know, and the realization of that pursuit and the fact I just didn't want to be unhappy anymore is the biggest contribution to my career that I could have made. I'm sorry if that sounds preachy, but it's the God's honest truth, you know?
Oh, it's super important. It's not, yeah. I very much want to leave it there because I'm not sure that we can top it, but I do feel like we should answer one more question just because I see one has popped up from Tino.
Okay.
And then we will call it because you're amazing and I don't want to take too much more of your time. But if you were to play Henry VI again, is there anything you would try to do differently, or would you rather not repeat the role at all? Thank you, Tino.
That's a great question. There's only one role I've ever played that I want to repeat, and that's Hamlet. Only because it was just the most incredible character to play ever, and it's one that I felt it was the first time I came to an end of a run, and I could have still been doing it and not being bored of it. Bored is a strong word, and there was still stuff I wanted to discover. So no, I wouldn't want to go back to Henry VI. But if I were to go back to Henry VI, what would I do differently? I think I'd leave 1 and 2 alone. It would be part 3 that I wanted to revisit because I feel there was an actor trying really hard, earnestly, really hard. As it got more complex and whatever, just trying really hard. I'd like to go back and trust a little more and not tell myself I need to cry when I do the molehill speech tonight. I want to cry when just all of that out the window and just do it. That's what I'd change.
Thank you, Chuk. I hope there are actors watching this because it is advice to be followed desperately. Please follow it.
Thank you.
And that is all the time we have. I've actually even pushed it a little bit. Chuk, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
You mentioned it earlier, and everyone should check it out. But can you tell everybody a little bit about Bounded with a Nutshell?
Yes, very quickly because I know we've reached the time limit. When the whole COVID thing started, I had recently just worked with some students that were about to graduate from drama school, and then COVID happened, and then friends of mine, I know a lot of people that work in the service industry, were out of jobs and all this stuff, and I sat there trying to figure out, well, what the hell can I do? So I was speaking with my wife about it, trying to get ideas. And then I called a friend of mine, Michelle Palmore, who I said, Michelle, look, if I wanted to do a show where I got guests in for Q&As and maybe a masterclass, how would we do it? And together we came up with the idea of the format of how we would do Bounded in a Nutshell, which is a show that I had amazing guests from Kristen Linklater to Richard Jenkins to, Corey Stoll to Jessica Hecht. It was just an amazing group of people who would come on, Michael Greif, come on, and they do an hour-long Q&A where I try to find out about their lives and how they got to where they go. Then later in the week, they'd come back and do a masterclass with lucky participants, and it was donation-based, and the money went towards theater artists that were out of work, and we raised over $9,500, and it went directly to the pockets of people that were out of work, and it was beautiful. So, and now we're about to launch it on our YouTube channel. So anyone that wants to catch it, we launch this month, in a few days. I have to check because I know nothing about technology. And we launch it where you'll be able to see the entire series and donate to a special organization called Figure Skating in Harlem, which is an amazing mentoring educational organization that takes girls from low-income families, and they mentor them, school them, and the caveat they get is to learn how to figure skate. It's quite stunning. So please check out Bounded in a Nutshell and come watch and donate. Thank you for giving me a chance to plug that, really.
Oh, of course, of course.
Yeah,
thank you. And it's well worth it. It's well worth it. Thank you so much for this, Chuk. It has been a true,
Thank you. It was a real
joy,
and everyone stay safe out there. Thank you for joining us and letting me talk and drink in front of you. It's great. Thanks, Nathan.
Cheers.
All right,
Thank
cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Everybody, thank you so much for joining us for this. Please do tune in next evening. We're going to do another remarkable podversation where I sit down with the Red Bull stalwart Matt Roush to discuss the next play in this tetralogy, Shakespeare's first great villain, Richard III, a role Matt played to great acclaim at Shakespeare Theatre of DC last year. If any of you might be interested in appearing on that program to ask a question of Matt, please look for upcoming emails. There'll be a link where you can submit those. Also, if you are hoping to watch this again or share it or watch any of the previous podversations, they are all available on our website, on Facebook, and on YouTube. And finally, if you are able to consider making a tax-deductible donation to support Red Bull programming and to invest in the vitality of classical theater, we are committed to continuing connection during this time of COVID-19, and your support will help to make that possible. Once more, thank you all. This has been Red Bull Theater's Remarkable Podversations. I'm your host, Nathan Winkelstein. With Richard III upcoming, we end fittingly with Shakespeare's cliffhanger from this play. King Henry and the prince his son are gone. Clarence, thy turn is next, and then the rest, counting myself but bad till I be best. Good night.